Hello there! In Acts chapter 8, the Apostle Philip tells the good news of Jesus Christ to an Ethiopian eunuch. The man joyfully accepted baptism from Philip and brought his new faith back to the Ethiopian court. He thereby began the legacy of African Christianity that continues to this day, a vibrant and growing family of faith with ancient roots and fascinating history. Although the Bible does not name this man, tradition gives his name as Simeon Bakos. Join us as we explore the world of ancient African Christianity that he originated. Join us as we follow along in Simeon's wake. Hello there. The story of ancient Christianity is a fascinating one, full of larger-than-life characters and massive controversies. Many different books have been written about the way that ancient Christians grew and flourished in the first few centuries after Christ. Less well known, at least in the English-speaking world, is the role played by the continent of Africa in the formation of ancient Christianity. Africa's churches are some of the oldest in all of Christendom, tracing their lineage all the way back to the book of Acts. African Christians proudly claim that St. Mark traveled to their continent as an evangelist and as the first bishop of Alexandria. Today, 734 million Christians claim Africa as home. 734 million descendants of that spiritual legacy. Africa is home to many vibrant and different expressions of the Christian faith. Some are ancient, like the Coptic and Ethiopian Orthodox churches. Others are quite new, such as Pentecostal churches. And Catholicism, Anglicanism, and other denominations continue to be well represented in its population. And Africa's spiritual legacy is not just confined to Africa. The Nicene Creed, now affirmed by over 1 billion Christians in the world, has its origins in a distinctly African controversy. St. Augustine of Hippo, the premier theologian of Western Catholic and Protestant churches, was born, raised, and worked in North Africa. Despite the richness of its history, the story of ancient African Christianity has yet to be told in its fullness. This podcast will attempt to fill part of that gap. On this journey, we'll be investigating how ancient African Christians lived, worshipped, and thought about their faith. One of the reasons I am so excited for this new journey is because it allows us to see multiple expressions of Christianity growing simultaneously. Our story will encompass the whole of Africa, but will often find itself centering on 3 very different cities. There is Alexandria, the capital city of the province of the East, with a long tradition of scholarly faith, massive wealth, and a large Jewish population that coexisted in an uneasy truce with the Gentile majority. Then there is Carthage, the ancient home of Rome's arch-rival, and the center of a Latin-speaking brand of Christianity that grappled with the realities of persecution and an often hostile imperial establishment. Third, there is Axum, the capital of the Kingdom of Ethiopia, where Christianity flourished entirely apart from the patronage of Constantine and his Christianized empire. Each of these 3 cities has something important to tell us about the growth of Christianity, and each will get its due in turn. Ancient African Christianity also spans important transitions in Roman history. The Roman conquests of Africa began while Rome was still a republic. Then Egypt fell under Roman sway shortly after Julius Caesar fell under Cleopatra's sway. As Caesar turned the republic into the empire, Africa became Roman. And of course, African Christianity would endure through centuries of hostile imperial attitudes to see the rise of Constantine and the elevation of Christianity to the official state religion of the empire. While the story of Africa is not the story of Rome, it does provide an opportunity for us to understand how Rome's transitions looked from the perspective of its outlying colonies. The story of ancient African Christianity is also the story of religion and race. This concept requires a little bit of explanation up front. It's something we'll talk about in the main episodes, but I want to say a few things right now. The first is that the ancient world did not have race in the sense that we conceptualize it today. Nowadays, when we talk about race, we are usually talking mainly about skin color. If you have light skin, you're white. If you have dark skin, you're black. If you have brown skin, you are Hispanic or Latino or perhaps Middle Eastern. And if you have very light skin, you might be classified as Asian, and so on and so on. In the ancient world, skin color was not the way that people determined your race. Why didn't they do it this way? Well, partly because skin color is actually a really bad way to divide people up. There are Italians who have darker skin than some Egyptians, yet Italians are white, and Egyptians are usually considered either black or Middle Eastern, depending on who you talk to. But the bigger reason is that when ancient sources talk about race, they are actually talking about something we would tend to think of today as ethnicity. Ancient race was about the people or nation that you came from. So your race would be Ethiopian, or Libyan, or Numidian, or Roman, or Gothic, not black or white. As such, there weren't really prejudices based on skin color in the way that we think of it today. In fact, at least one Roman emperor, Septimus Severus, would probably be considered black or brown today, and no one saw him as anything other than Roman. When people of the time mention skin color in a pejorative way, it's usually tied to class. For example, in the Song of Songs, chapter 1, verse 4, many translations have the female speaker saying, "I am black, but beautiful." In other words, it depicts her dark skin as something opposed to her beauty. However, this was not because black skin was considered unattractive in itself. It was rather that if you had dark skin, it was probably from a tan you got working outside all day, which meant you were part of the lower class. Alas, poverty has never been that sexy. I find it so important to talk about this because of our modern troubles about race. The world is convulsed by artificial divisions placed between people of different races, and we would all do well to study the Roman Empire and its pre-racial paradise of tolerance and equality in which people of all nations gathered around the campfire every night to sing Kumbaya. Yeah, I'm just messing with you. There was a ton of prejudice based on your ethnicity in the Roman Empire. It just wasn't based on skin color. It was based on your country or people of origin and their relationship to Rome. So if you were from the Persian Empire, Rome's great rival in the East, you were going to be treated with a lot of suspicion. If your people had risen up in revolt against Rome, you were going to catch pain for it. And God help you if you were from a tribe outside the empire, in other words, a barbarian. Although, interestingly enough, there is some evidence that Romans tended to view these groups as a kind of noble savage. Not all that different from the way that European colonizers viewed Native Americans and Native Africans. All this means, in other words, that it wasn't so much being from Africa that was an important part of the Christians' racial experience, as it was being from the part of Africa that they hailed from. The Roman Empire treated different provinces very differently. And, of course, members of the church had their own prejudices that they wrestled with varying degrees of success. One of the biggest divides had to do with whether you hailed from the eastern or western side of the Roman provinces. Because the Roman Empire did not have the consideration to take 21st century church history podcasters into account when dividing its territories, the geographic distinctions between East and Western empires don't map neatly onto the lines of modern countries. For example, Alexandria, which sits just north of modern-day Cairo, is very firmly in the eastern part of the empire. But hop over to modern-day Libya and you'll find it split evenly between the eastern and western halves of the empire. This geographical divide was also a linguistic one. In the east, the dominant language was Greek, while Latin predominated in the west. The eastern half of the empire tended to be a bit more cosmopolitan, and most of the best academies and schools in the empire were in the east. This is nowhere more true than in Africa, where Alexandria was a beacon of learning and culture renowned the world over for its scholarly output and its famous library. As a consequence, Eastern Romans generally knew Greek and at least some Latin. Western Romans were often ignorant of Greek, as was famously the case with St. Augustine. The West also tended to be a little bit more rural, oriented towards agriculture. So if you came to Alexandria from, say, Spain, you might be treated as a country bumpkin with no manners or learning, whereas an Alexandrian traveling in Europe might be viewed as a hoity-toity intellectual. Africa, then, is the site of all kinds of different cultural encounters between Roman and non-Roman, between East and West, between those close to the Mediterranean and those further inland. And the whole story of African Christianity begins as the story of an intercultural encounter. For the first African convert to the faith, as you know from the intro bit, is found in Acts chapter 9. The Apostle Philip encounters an Ethiopian eunuch who is trying to read the book of Isaiah. Philip asks if he understands it. The eunuch replies that he can't, so Philip hops in his chariot and cheerfully starts explaining it to him. The passage he was reading was from Isaiah and described the suffering servant of God. And I quote, "Like a sheep he was led to the slaughter, and like a lamb before its shearer is silent, so he opens not his mouth. In his humiliation justice was denied him. Who can describe his generation? For his life is taken away from the earth." End quote. Here we have an intercultural encounter par excellence. An African court official asks a Jewish man to help him understand a Jewish text written hundreds of years prior. Philip tells him that this text points to Jesus of Nazareth, the Jewish Messiah and Savior of the whole world, both Jew and Gentile. The eunuch, moved by this gospel story, asks to be baptized immediately. Philip assents, and the eunuch continues on his way, bringing the gospel back to the royal court. While the eunuch's name is not given in the Bible, ancient church traditions tell us that his name was Simeon Bacchus. He was the first to bring Christianity to Africa. He was the first to bring this Jewish message to his Ethiopian confreres and to inaugurate the long story of African engagement with the Jewish Messiah. To follow the story of African Christianity is to follow his legacy. So I hope you will join me as we travel along in Simeon's wake. As we prepare for our journey, I do have a few notes about how the podcast will proceed. First, the time period covered. This is sort of an open-ended podcast. My goal is to tell the story of ancient African Christianity. So that naturally raises the question of when African Christianity stops being ancient. There are several different answers to that question. My answer is, I don't know really. I'm just going to keep going and, kind of see what the vibe is. I'm being a little facetious here, but only a little. Usually, scholars treat African Christianity as ancient up to either the Council of Chalcedon in the mid-400s or until the rise of Islam. I'm not yet sure where I will draw the line myself, but suffice it to say that I expect it will take us at least a couple of years to get to that point, and I'll let you know more as I know more. Second, the schedule. Those of you who listened to my first podcast, The Road to Nicaea, knew that I tended to release one main episode, usually something like 25 to 35 minutes, every other week. I'm changing the schedule a bit to experiment with longer form content, something like 45 minutes to an hour. Where appropriate, I'll pepper supplemental episodes, but we're going to have one proper episode a month. The supplemental episodes will be there to cover material that doesn't really matter to the main story, but is just too good not to share. I may also use the supplementals to tell you about ancient Christian things that don't relate to just Africa, but that I like so much I simply can't resist telling you about them. Supplemental episodes won't follow any particular schedule, they will just come up when they're relevant in the main story. Third, the approach to the material. My goal is to make this history accessible to people who don't have any advanced training in religion or ancient history. So, for example, when I'm describing an ancient city, I'm going to tell you its modern-day equivalent. Like I said, the city of Alexandria is just a bit north of modern-day Cairo. Serious historian types tend not to like this habit because it is technically an anachronism. For example, an ancient Egyptian living under Roman rule wouldn't have lived in Egypt, they would have lived in the Diocese of the Oriens. But ancient Egyptians aren't listening to my podcast. Modern people are, and modern people sometimes need a bit of orientation to see where everything would be on a map. So I will do that. In general, where I can relate ancient controversies to modern realities, I do so. That doesn't mean they are exactly the same, of course, but it does mean that the analogies are close enough to be helpful. Fourth, the crucial question of the podcast. What exactly is Africa? The question is not quite as silly as it sounds. The boundaries of Africa have been contested since ancient times. The Roman Empire divided Africa into at least two distinct provinces. North Africa, which contains modern-day Tunisia and Algeria and a good bit of Libya, and the province of the East, which contained Egypt and some parts of Libya. There were also a couple of other provinces farther to the west, but those aren't really part of our story. Now, these two provinces were culturally distinct. As we said, Latin was the dominant language in North Africa, while the province of the East spoke Greek and revolved around the economic and cultural hub of Alexandria. You can't really assume that what is true of one of those regions is true of the other. Even outside of Roman history, the question of what to do with Egypt is a tricky one. Ever since Alexander the Great swept through, Egyptian rulers tended to have Greek ancestries, not Egyptian ancestries, and they were thoroughly Hellenistic. Moreover, Egypt had strong ties to Mesopotamia, and was just as often dealing with its allies and rivals in the Middle East as in Africa. Beyond all of that, we often tend to equate Africa with the experience of those people identified as black. But the story of Africa is not the same thing as the story of blackness. For one thing, blackness as a racial category doesn't really exist until the 1500s. More on that later. But equally as important is that not all the peoples of Africa have dark skin. In fact, the Berbers, an indigenous people you will find in North Africa even today, often has skin as light as a European's. And the Phoenicians, who founded the great city of Carthage, were Semitic. The story of Africa is the story of the interactions of all these groups, including the dark-skinned peoples who called it home, but not limited to only them. We must ask, what is Africa, as far as this podcast is concerned? To which I answer, for the purposes of this podcast, Africa is the continent of Africa. The subject matter of this podcast is everything that happened to Christians who lived on that continent. That's probably the answer you would have come up with before I added all of those complicating details. But now, you can feel superior and sophisticated because you know them all, and you can quote them at dinner parties when someone asks you what Africa is. Assuming you go to the sorts of dinner parties where people want to hear complicated theories about the definitions of Africa, which I think only happen in the TV show Frasier. But if you find one, you should go to them. They sound fun. I have chosen this definition for several reasons. First, I wanted as expansive a definition as possible. This is a podcast that tells a story, after all. It's hard enough to section off Africa from the rest of the Christian world. I didn't want to restrict myself any further. Second, whatever Africa meant in ancient times, nowadays it usually means the continent of Africa. Since that definition is the one most familiar, that is the one I want to use. Third, and most importantly, I have absolutely zero interest in gatekeeping the notion of Africa. I don't know if anyone should be deciding who or what counts as African, but it is surely not me, a person whose ancestors all come from so far north in Europe that they probably never even heard of a tomato, let alone Africa. My goal is to tell the story of what happened to Christians on the continent of Africa. Anything that happens on that land or affects it is fair game. Anything that happens off the continent and is not immediately relevant to its inner workings is off limits. Unless it's really juicy. Or unless I get too excited and tell you about it anyway and try to make it relevant to Africa even though it's not, and you know it's not, and I know it's not, but listen, you guys, I really like this stuff. Can we just roll with it? I'll put that in the supplementals. Fifth and finally, there are some options for how to support my work. This podcast is a labor of love. It is and will remain free. However, running a podcast does take work. It takes specialized equipment. It takes time and dedication. It takes a lot of reading. And it takes a bunch of teas and other little drinks to power me through the work of reading, analyzing, writing, and recording. If you want to help me buy said little drinks, you now have an option to do so. I have begun a Patreon. The link is in the description of this episode, and if you want to support me, I encourage you to check it out. For $3 per month, you can join the Coffee Hour tier, where you can have the satisfaction of subsidizing my tea habits and showing hospitality to a very tired podcaster. If you want to contribute more, the $10 per month Inquirers tier allows for a bit more personal interaction. You can ask me questions, and I will answer them in a future podcast episode. Well, questions about ancient African history, anyway. If you ask me about something else, I probably won't answer. Or I may. You never know. I have a lot of opinions. But anyway, my hope is that this will allow us to have some listener interactions and make the podcast more responsive to your curiosities. That's all for this introductory episode. I look forward to this journey and hope you will join me for it. And in fact, you can start right now. What, did you think I was going to give you a short intro and then put off actual content for a whole month? Nah, episode 1 is already up. Go check it out. I'll see you there as we encounter the very first waves left behind by Simeon's Wake. Thank you for listening to In Simeon's Wake, part of the Earth and Altar Podcast Network. If you liked the episode, please leave it a review and drop a like on that episode at your earliest convenience, or even before. It's nice. If you'd like to support this work, head on over to patreon.com/Ben Wyatt. That's patreon.com/Ben Wyatt, WYATT. Until next time, stay curious.